So now I will start with a disclaimer. I think that is more appropriate because it's a very salty topic. I have a lot to say about it. I will use a very strong language. So in all fairness, I just point out that this is not a critique or delegitimization of the NGO world or the aid or humanitarian aid per se, but it's the peculiarity of this situation that is to be criticized, where there are enormous efforts to try to remedy a political problem with humanitarian solutions. But as I write here, the underlying message that I would argue for today is that humanitarian solutions cannot remedy a political problem, and only a political solution can end the need for humanitarian painkillers. And the word painkiller, I will expand more on it later. But to start with a brief introduction of Gaza, how many people here are familiar with the specificities of the situation in there? And has anyone been to Gaza before at any time? Okay. So basically there is this very technical and tedious picture that describes all the specificities of what's happening, the limitation of the fishing zone, the limitation on the borders, the closure in general. It is combined with statistics on the population and the area of Gaza and how small it is, with a very dense population. But I will skip that because that would put us to sleep. And I think a more interesting visual representation of Gaza is this picture taken from a space station, from the International Space Station by Thomas Biscuit. And he just posted a general picture of the Middle East. And that was one of the pictures that he posted on Twitter. And you can visibly see the blockade on Gaza from space. You can also see the population density. So in Israel, you can see here all the kibbutzim and moshavim, where there's a lot of green, a lot of farms individually spread around, whereas in Gaza, it's concentration of gray colors everywhere. And that is just an indication of a concrete jungle running out of space with a hugely dense population. In terms of the political situation, as you might be aware, so Gaza is under the control of the de facto government of Hamas, which Israel considers a terrorist group, so they do not have any contact with them. And the West Bank is under the control of the Palestinian Authority, which has official and formal contact with Israel. And that issue will come up later with a very interesting point. So here I have just 4 bullet points that I will try to speak about, and it might be boring as bullet points, but with the first Palestinian Intifada in 1987, you see Palestinian civil society becoming organized without a direct involvement of the PLO, grouping together in civil strikes, general strikes, and acts of civil disobeyment to Israel. And that grows into a whole, what is called as an intifada, in English uprising or rebellion. And that goes on for several years until it dies out with the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993. And the remarkable thing about the Intifada is that Palestinians back then were fully under Israel's control only in the Gaza Strip, in the West Bank, inside Israel. So when the Intifada happened, one of the things that Palestinians were focused on is to achieve self-sufficiency. So in some examples that have been turned into movies, there is one example in which Palestinians in a village in the West Bank brought about, I think, 13 cows to provide for the whole village, and Israel announced those cows as terrorists, and they wanted their immediate confiscation and arrest because it threatened the whole dependency of the Palestinian population on their occupier. But with the Oslo Accords and the incomplete nation-state building, we have Israel giving the Palestinian Authority limited autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza in specific parts of them, or specific parts of the West Bank in particular, Area A, and to some extent in Area B, less than 30% of the overall area of the West Bank, and not in Jerusalem. And the PA is trying to create a state without having one. And in that process, we see a lot of activists and a lot of civil society organizers being lured into the sector of the NGOs. So everyone that was, not everyone in specific, but people that were outspoken, organizing actively out there, suddenly were lured into the promise of having a nice office with a leather seat and a wooden table and invitations to go to conferences in New York and in Geneva and Europe. And that promise attracts a lot of Palestinians. And that begins with the whole NGOization of civil society, in which incrementally and increasingly these NGOs become, I wouldn't say fully subservient, but become very much reliant on the agenda of the donors rather than their own. And that begins an era that I can identify now with more confidence as something that I lived through, is that as of now, the latest statistics that I checked is that in Gaza, there is around 1,200 NGOs. So one NGO for each 800 people almost. And with that significant number, you can see that it isn't that normal. I would compare it maybe to Denmark and see how many are there and how many of them are engaged in humanitarian relief, and not sure if it would be comparable. But in the case of Gaza, 1,200 NGOs, there is a significant amount of international NGOs as well, and humanitarian organizations working in Gaza. You've got the full menu, as they say. And with that, you can see that there is funding coming. Sometimes it's been decreasing increasingly over the years, but there is funding coming. Sometimes it's hundreds of millions that pour into Gaza. Sometimes it could exceed $1 billion, such as in the case of the state of Qatar pledging significant amounts to the reconstruction of Gaza, or European donors pledging amounts to UNRWA and other international NGOs. And you can see that Gaza's situation is just moving from bad to worse. And the way that it's immediately phrased by my friends and family in Gaza is that they would describe today as the absolute worst. Yesterday is remembered with great fondness, and yet tomorrow they can predict with certainty that it will be much worse than today. And that contradiction with having a significant amount of money pouring in, a significant amount of NGOs, and the humanitarian situation moving from bad to worse is a little bit peculiar. But if you look at some of the main catchphrases, the things that attract immediate funding, you can see the frivolity and, let's say, the endless loop that they are entrapped in. So some of the things that would attract a lot of donors' attentions is, for instance, women's empowerment. And that, if I say that here, it makes sense. If I say that in Gaza, it would crack as a joke. Everyone is going to laugh in the room. And another thing is youth empowerment and leadership skills development and time management enhancement. And it goes on and on, youth reconciliation, societal unity, and the list of all those sort of catchphrases that are trendy within the donor community. And when it comes to the implementation, for instance, with women's empowerment, if you've having gone to some of these events and knowing the details of how they go, it's basically the same as youth empowerment, where people are coming in for the lunch. There's an empty talk, a lot of slogans, a lot of speech making, and then everybody goes home. And the whole thing that happens here is just a significant amount of funding is put into organizing this event, into bringing experts, into paying for the venue, for the lunch, for the transportation. At the end of it, you go back home remembering almost nothing of what happened there. So a personal example of youth empowerment program is just that me and some of my friends would get a notification that, this NGO today is offering shawarma if you go and attend a talk about the necessity of abolishing capital punishment. And the necessity of abolishing capital punishment, which is already not in use under the Palestinian Authority, is a topic that's coming from outer space. It's not touching an immediate population need. It's not going to solve anything. It's not going to move forward or backward. And then going to that venue, you just sit, everyone is bored out of their minds. There is a young motivational speaker that's probably a university student or a recent graduate that was brought in to give the talk. Most of the time, they do not have, let's say, a job at the same time that they give this. So it's volunteer activities that they're trying to build their own CVs and their own profile. And the talk goes on, and the discussion, sometimes it's capital punishment, sometimes it's organizational skills, time management skills, youth de-radicalization, whatever the fancy title or jargon is put in there. And the thing that happens at the end of it is just eating the lunch. That's where the core substance of the event, and then going back, not remembering much of what happened there. Again, I will try not to say that this is an absolute generalization. I know a lot of organizations in Gaza and Palestine in general that are not only doing a great work, but some are putting their lives almost literally on the line to do the work in these territories. But again, with the catchphrases, so there is the issue with focusing so much on enhancing leadership skills, where you bring a lot of young people to boost their self-confidence that they can be leaders, they can take initiative, they can invent their own wheel. But the problem is that in let's say, a deeply divided society, and it's not innately divided by, let's say, inherent characteristics, but due to political factors, you have Fatah, Hamas divided, you have the divisions within that between different parties. Does it make sense to drive every individual into inventing their own wheel, or would it make sense to try to make an initiative that brings them together, that enhances collaboration? And this sort of focus on the individual rather than the group is sometimes leading to unfavorable consequences. So some of the young people that go through the leadership skills training, it's of course very nice for a CV, it's very nice skills that you learn in general, but like there are no real prospects to fulfill what you just studied. It's the same for de-radicalization. You go in there, learn a lot about how to work on your demeanor, how to discover any psychological problems that affect you, and how to return to a normal life. But the problem is that in Gaza, there is not a normal life to begin with. And let's say psychological rehabilitation or support is supposed to return you to a normal track in life, which is non-existent in this situation. So that disproportionate focus on things that are not substantially addressing the political problem, the underlying core of this situation, end up being a waste of time or space. Some youth end up inventing their own groups, their own NGOs, their own movements. Some of them have very nice purposes and objectives and core messages. So for instance, one young friend of mine that I know, or a classmate, he made a library with English books and called it Edward Said's Library, and that's going very well to some extent. But in other cases, there is also the promise that one of the ways you can get money if you cannot get a job, there is no employability prospect in the public sector as well, is to be an entrepreneur of misery, which means to organize a fundraising campaign online to buy 100 blankets for poor people, and you take a commission out of that, and it goes on and on and on. And it ends up with a sort of toxic competitiveness, because there are not a lot of donors out there, limited amount of good-hearted people, and a lot of people trying to make this into a living. Decent, honest living, maybe. It depends on the individual case, where people are genuinely trying to help out. But again, the induced toxic competitiveness of this is the same with the NGO sector, where some NGO leaders or directors would try to speak badly to the donors about other NGOs so that they don't get the funding and we get it instead. And some would go to the extent of saying, like, this NGO is only a front cover for Hamas. it's a terrorist organization. If you go into the NGO, you're not going to find any work done. You're just going to find a giant tunnel in the living room. And it goes way more than that to try to just push donors away from them and keep donors here, because the donors are decreasing. Israel, unfortunately, the Israeli government is trying to work a lot, and pro-Israeli lobbies, to decrease funding to Palestinian civil society and delegitimize civil society in general. So funding is limited and decreasing. The number of NGOs is growing, and that leads to create a situation where just fighting for basic survival by any means. One last thing of the catchphrases is with the international NGOs, in fairness. So I talk very strongly with a very salty language about local NGOs, but with international NGOs, the case is not much better. So for instance, some of the largest international organizations, they have what's called unemployment programs, in which any graduate with the highest academic qualification, so someone with a master's degree in engineering, or someone who studied economics or accounting, etc., the population of Gaza is very highly educated. And then you go and apply for this unemployment program and wait until indefinitely until your name shows up in the system. Then you basically are put on the payroll for maybe 3 months to almost do nothing. In some situations, if you're lucky, you can get a little bit of work to do here and there, maybe administrative tasks, maybe working in construction sites. If there is any construction happening, as Israel is limiting the amount of construction material going to Gaza. But in most cases, or in some cases that I've seen with my eyes, they would bring maybe 20 people who are part of this unemployment program, give each one of them a broomstick, and just ask them to clean the sand in the street with a broomstick, push it a little bit to the right, and then once they're done, push it back to the left, because you need to have them doing something. And with the other problem that I noticed is the international organizations' foreign staff, whilst they are in Gaza, it's almost certainly always the case that they will drive in armored vehicles, in these armored SUVs, never stepping a foot outside, going back to the compound where they would never go out to engage with the local population, because of course there are security necessities that they need to uphold and maintain. Some people challenge this, others not so much. I encountered in Gaza some people who work in even UN programs that I encountered by mere coincidence, that I didn't even know they existed, let alone lived in Gaza. Moving from there, with the donors' conditionalities, that is another problematic dimension. And to quickly sum it with that donor conditionalities, I would take one example, is terror listing. So European donors, American donors are even more extreme. They have to abide by regulations that they need to maintain that there wouldn't be any beneficiaries belonging to a terror group designated by either Europe or the US. In the case of the US, that sometimes entails all mainstream political parties in Palestine. Sometimes even the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, is considered by the American Congress as a terrorist entity in certain cases. So that was cited by the Trump administration to shut down the PLO office in Washington and kick the whole envoy out. So that listing of the all mainstream political groups almost. In the case of Europe, it lists a group called the Palestinian Popular Front for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP, which is the secular leftist party or group that is home to the Palestinian intelligentsia. So people who identify as secular or leftist, especially in the old generation, are part of this group. And one of the reasons it's blacklisted is that it carried out some armed actions against Israel in the 70s and 80s, and they have not explicitly denounced it as of now, but as of today, the group does not have any significant operational armed activities to speak of. It's not even, the whole movement is not alive anymore. There is a limited amount of people that subscribe or introduce themselves as affiliates of the PFLP, especially from the Palestinian intelligentsia. Some of them are heads of civil society groups and organizations, because those, let's say, the leftist Palestinian political spectrum are the people who created unions, who created associations and charities, and some of them have this political affiliation. Another group that's terror listed by Europe is Hamas, of course, but in the case of the PFLP, that is now a very resonant theme nowadays over the last week in specific, is that Europe asks any beneficiaries of its funding to make sure that recipients of these NGOs programs will not be from any blacklisted group, in the case of the US as well. So the only way that it works is that these NGOs need to act as subcontractors for the US or Europe to surveil their beneficiaries, collect information on them, make sure that they're on the safe side, that they do not have any sort of suspicious affiliations or something that's frowned upon in Europe or the US, and subsequently blacklist any people that Europe would consider problematic. If you speak in theoretical terms of ensuring that European funding does not end up in the hands of terrorist groups or movements, that's of course understandable by law. But when it comes to the actual implementation, what's happening here is that, for instance, some of these groups are blacklisted based on a request from Israel, not based on actual evidence that incriminates them and leads Europe to believe that they pose a clear threat that garner or meet the merit of blacklisting them. So I think a European court in 2014 ordered the delisting of even Hamas, said that remove Hamas from the terror list, because terror listing it in the late 90s was not reliant on sufficient evidence that merit this label. So you have to remove it. Then the European Commission comes out and says we cannot remove it for political reasons. They don't even look into it. And that's the case with the PFLP and other groups that are terror listed, is that you can see with European decision makers, some are convinced that there is no necessity for this, but at the same time, they don't want to pick up a personal fight with Israel. They don't want to end up being bashed in the media as supporting a blacklisted group, so they try to avoid the topic altogether. But in implementation, what this does is further fueling the division within Palestinian society, in which these NGOs, if they work on ending torture, well, they're not allowed to talk to Hamas. So how are they going to work on this aspect? If they are trying to advocate for ending capital punishment, they're not allowed to talk to Hamas. They're not allowed to have Hamas members collaborating with them. So that impedes the core work of these organizations and further fuels divisions. The last thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of local NGOs is basically what Israel does to tame those civil society organizations. One of the most prominent examples in Gaza is the permit regime, that if you want to travel outside Gaza through Israel, you need to obtain a security permit from Israel in advance. It takes about 45 days in the best case scenario. For the majority of the population, they would never get it. I applied twice, I never got it. It's considered an enormous privilege rather than a right. So for Israel, they would say that, for instance, I do not qualify to receive a permit to cross and travel abroad because I am under the specified age that is out of security concerns, which is the age sometimes above 45, other times above 55, and other times 65. So I can wait for those few decades and then apply again. For many other cases, some cases it goes as bad as banning cancer patients from receiving medical treatment in Palestinian hospitals in the West Bank. Although the Oslo Accord specifies that the West Bank and Gaza are a single territorial unit. So Israel suddenly says that, no, for security reasons, unexplained, you're not allowed to travel to the West Bank, even though it's a terminal illness. And with these permits, it's granted by Israeli law in special and exceptional humanitarian cases, granted to the staff of international NGOs and international media and journalists. But some representatives of Palestinian civil society or some heads of NGOs are given the privilege of having a one-time permit or a continuous permit to cross back and forth to the West Bank or to Jerusalem, most of the time mainly to meet with Europeans, not to meet with other Palestinian civil society, but to meet with European and American delegations that are coming for a few days, attend a workshop here or there, a roundtable discussion, and then return. And a friend of mine who is the head of a Gaza-based branch of a prominent German think tank that I will avoid the name of it for his personal privacy, but he enjoyed the permit to go back and forth between Gaza and Jerusalem and between Gaza and the West Bank until the 2014 war happened on Gaza. And him being Gazan himself, he was personally affected, traumatized, suffered as everybody else. And he was approached by a German news outlet that asked to interview him about what's happening there. And he gave a strong worded interview that Israel didn't like as much. That interview, I think it was in mid-2015, almost immediately after Israel suddenly realized that for security reasons, he's not allowed to travel to Jerusalem or the West Bank anymore. And that goes on for almost a year. His employers try to intervene. Diplomatic missions try to intervene. It works out eventually, but he gets the message that just don't speak up. For another head of NGO, he would privately, in personal discussions, say that he has learned how to speak to foreigners, not how to speak his mind, but how to speak to foreigners, what they expect to hear, the things that will not raise any red flags with Israel, the things that would maintain his privilege, being able to travel back and forth to the West Bank, Jerusalem, travel abroad to the world, and continue to receive funding. So he takes pride in having perfected language that would keep him in the safe side. The other thing that Israel does is blacklisting a whole organization, civil society, or NGO altogether. Most recently, Israel came out and blacklisted 6 NGOs in Palestine. One of them is called the Defense of Children International. What they work on is provide legal representation to Palestinian children arrested by Israel, either arbitrarily or with the charges of throwing stones on an Israeli military vehicle passing by. So they provide legal aid to Palestinian children, and they research and document violations against Palestinian children. And Israel blacklisted them based on a pretext that the head of the organization in Palestine has ties to the PFLP, the leftist secular movement that's barely alive, does not have any military activities, but is blacklisted under Israeli law, under European regulations, and by the US. So based on guilt by association, they just blacklisted the organization altogether. Another organization is called Al-Haq, and they were one of the oldest civil society groups in Palestine. They were established in 1979. And Israel blacklisted them on the same charge, PFLP. That's it. You just put those 4 initials and do anything after that. The remarkable thing is that this time European and American governments and politicians and decision makers came out vocally and said that even if you claim they are associated with the PFLP, we have repeatedly vetted these organizations. We have repeatedly vetted the funding we're giving to them. We found no evidence of wrongdoing. But Israel carried on with blacklisting them. The main reason for blacklisting Al-Haq is basically that, as Israel itself writes, as Minister of Defense in Israel, Benny Gantz, wrote in the memorandum, that Al-Haq quote unquote, promotes step against Israel in the international arena. So it criticizes Israel at the UN Human Rights Council because it enjoys a consultative status. It's been part of the Palestinian bid at the International Criminal Court to investigate crimes committed both by Israel and Palestinians that Israel is terrified of. So they basically very explicitly cite that the basis for not blacklisting them, but even worse, terror listing them, is that they engage in steps against Israel in international arenas. So that weapon of blacklisting and the weapon of the permit regime that is utilized as, let's say, a biopower to control the lives of people, to control even their exposure to the experience of living or near death, is yielded against civil society to ensure that they remain within the line. If you want your organization to continue functioning, you want to continue having your privilege, work with things that do not make anyone upset, which is, again, women empowerment, youth leadership enhancement skills, time management skills, de-radicalization, and unemployment programs. But on that note, to conclude with something positive about some of the civil society groups and organizations in there, to not be overly critical, as I said, there are a lot that are doing tremendously great work in Gaza and the West Bank and Jerusalem. So for instance, one group that I know in Gaza is, and I will try not to name drop so that I'm not biased in favor of one or the other, but they provide training for Gazan youth with a salaried training. So they basically say, come here for 6 months, we're gonna get a student allowance for these 6 months, which is almost unheard of. And we train you on computer programming skills that would enable you to do work freelancing remotely so that you are not bounded by the conditions of the blockade. Another group, it brings young people to just tell their stories, and it provides them with mentors to help them to enhance their ability to communicate to the outside world, to just speak up and say what's happening to them, and maybe teach them English, just provide them with some expertise on how to approach people, what to write about, how to frame it, how to write an opinion piece, etc. And there are numerous unions. So there is the farmers union, there is the women's union, there are some women shelters for women that suffer domestic violence and abuse, the same for children, the same even for men. There is a mental health program in Gaza that's doing tremendous work to deal with PTSDs with children. So UNICEF, I think they estimated in 2014, 7 years ago, that about 500,000 children in Gaza suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. That number after the last war in May was brought up to nearly 92% of the young population is suffering from PTSDs. So there are a lot of civil society and NGOs that are doing the tremendous work. But the underlying issue here is, again, this sort of fueling Palestinian divisions, fueling a toxic competitiveness between NGOs, deciding and dictating what kind of work merits European or American funding, what kind of work is not worthwhile, and regardless of the actual results. So if gender mainstreaming is more trendy than helping Palestinian children with PTSDs, then donors would go with that. And that is hugely problematic. The other case that I want to now explain is a more bizarre case study. It's full of contradictions, even more than the aid industry and the NGO industry world. When now the line between Israel saying that these are terrorist groups, we don't have anything to do with them, and we blacklist any organization that works with them, is going to completely be destroyed and dismantled. So in 2018, in March in Pacific, there was a process for Palestinian reconciliation that collapsed. It didn't work out as wished. There was evident hopelessness and frustration amongst the general population in Gaza. They saw that there's never going to be a united government recognized by the international community that leads to lifting up the blockade on Gaza. It's going to remain as it is indefinitely. So something spontaneous started along the borders of Gaza. It's not specifically borders because Israel did not define its geographical borders yet, but it's more of a perimeter fence that anyone that approaches Israeli defense soldiers would immediately shoot to kill. So some Palestinian activists, journalists, just took a tent and put it near the perimeter fence, around, I think, 300 or 400 meters away from it, and just sat in that tent. And then it began to develop more and more. A population that's caged literally from birth to death in what the UN itself has declared to be an uninhabitable territory with no way out and nothing working. And that tent started a whole movement where it just grew, more people came in, even political groups, even groups that people like Hamas, who until then maintained that armed resistance is the only way that it works. Nonviolence is for the weak-hearted. It's not working. They ridiculed the Palestinian Authority or the president of the PA, Mahmoud Abbas, for saying that nonviolence is the way for liberation, and they believe that might makes right. Then you can see mainstream political groups flocking to that tent, one after the other, including Hamas. And it builds up into a movement that's called the Gaza Great Return March, or Great March of Return, in which the main purpose of it is that we put more tents distant from the borders, 500 or 300 meters away from the borders, and people just come in, look at the land behind that. 2/3 of Gaza's population are refugees or descendants of refugees, so they get to see the land that literally their grandparents, fathers, or even themselves were uprooted from on the eve of Israel's establishment in 1948 or during the Six-Day War in 1967. So they can see the lands that they are yearning to return to, their original hometowns, as we call it. And people started to go there just to look at the fence, look at what's beyond it, and compare. There is life here, there's no life here. And it was designed to be an event that lasts for 6 weeks. It started on, or it was scheduled to start on the Palestinian Land Day and ends on the Palestinian Nakba Day. Nakba Day is the Israel's Day of Independence, the same day that Palestinians were kicked out of their homes. So it's commemorated as Nakba Day, or fled from their homes. So that was March 30th would be the beginning. The few days preceding the protests were remarkable on many levels and scales. You had Hamas leaders coming out to call on people to remain peaceful, avoid going to the border fence, staying away from it. You had leaders of a movement that's perceived as more hardline than Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, coming out and saying that if you start any violence in these protests, it would give Israel a pretext to kill it. So let's not start any violence there. And the top leader of Hamas stood in front of a giant billboard with Nelson Mandela's face on it, with Malcolm X, and with Gandhi. He does not speak English well. He started to mutter and say, I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream, to just evoke the connotation of that we're trying to do the same as these movements. And until the first day of the protests, you had almost all political groups convinced that we should maintain independence at these protests. Only the Palestinian flag is allowed. No flag of any political group is going to be there. We should maintain peacefulness as to not give Israel pretext to either ignore or suppress the protests. And then on the Israeli side, a discussion is happening. So in 2015, and a former Israeli ambassador said that Israel's worst nightmare would be a scenario in which individual Gazans simply knock down the fence. It's literally a fence, barbed wire. Just knock down the fence and walk into Israel and stay, just sit down and stay there. What are we going to do with them? And an Israeli general called Amos Gilad said in a 2011 cable that was declassified by WikiLeaks, quote unquote, "We do not do Gandhi very well." So the Israeli army knows perfectly how to handle Hamas when it shoots rockets. If it shoots rockets, we destroy more. If they kill one person, we kill 100, it's over. But they don't know how to deal with a nonviolent movement, per Amos Gilad's own admission, that they do not know how to deal with a nonviolent movement, because it does not look well in pictures. Then we approach the few days before the protest, and that statement is made by the Israeli Minister of Energy, in which he suggests literally parachuting food and medicine and protesters to bribe them and lure them into leaving the protest and going back home. So you can see a full acknowledgement in the Israeli political establishment. This is a minister of the Likud party, which is hard right. He was in the group or the political party that's headed by Benjamin Netanyahu at the time, the prime minister of Israel back then, and he makes this very clear statement, which shows that Israel knows that it left the population of Gaza to near starvation. In another statement from the Israeli Minister of Defense back then, Avigdor Lieberman, he said in an interview very proudly that our policy in Gaza is to keep the population's head above the water with their bodies drowned, nothing more and nothing less. So to keep them away from death, but not allowing them to die, and not allowing them to have a life either. So parachuting food. In another article that I didn't have time to put there, it was in an Israeli newspaper that's called the Yediot Ahronot. I think it was published even in Arabic, in which a veteran Israeli columnist begs Gazans, what are you doing? This is insane. You're risking your life. Please don't go to these protests. If there's anything wrong that we've done, we can work on it, but don't show up on March 30th. And then March 30th comes along. And on the first day, Israel kills between 14 to 16 protesters, wounds hundreds more. The Israeli snipers are located behind these giant sand duns, well protected. So here you can see snipers. And the Gazan population is located, here's the barbed wire fence, they are there. And people who turned up to the protest, some of them just stood by the fence, or stood by the encampment, and others went up to the fence to try to knock it down. The worst case scenario, as a former ambassador, Israeli ambassador said, knock it down and just walk into Israel, which is something that Israel would have never allowed. At the encampments, people started to throw balloons in Israel's direction that literally read, I was born under the blockade. In others, it read, we just want a life, we want to live. It was any message that could come across any mind in the room. They just wrote any message that they could think of, strapped it on a balloon, throw it Israel's way. No media coverage of that, nothing's happening. And on the first day of the protests, you have the New York Times, the Guardian, the Washington Post, the entire mainstream media apparatus describing these protests as riots or clashes, to draw symmetry between people who showed up at the borders barehanded and Israeli snipers that are well hidden behind these giant sand duns. With that, after the first day, people came up with the idea of these burned tires. Traditionally, it's used as an expression of frustration and anger and rage in the street. It was used in the first and second Intifadas. But people in this instant brought up the tires as a smoke screen to protect them from sniper fire. Just provide a shield and a cover. And of course, the Israeli government came up. When I say Israel, it's referred to the government exclusively, not as a society. So the Israeli government comes up and says that, look, Palestinians don't care about the environment, they don't care about the planet, what about climate change, look at what they're doing, and becomes a huge debate back then. And these two things, the tires and the balloons, I will come back to them in reference to the aid industry in a second. This case requires a little bit of elaboration on the background, but I promise that they will be of great use later on. So protests continue almost on a daily basis. They culminate and bring the most amount of people on Fridays until Thursday, March 15, 2018. That was the day in which Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, Jason Greenblatt, David Friedman, the entire Trump team to the Middle East was in Jerusalem to open the new Israeli embassy in Jerusalem, which was a catastrophic move in terms of the two-state solution, but it's a topic that I will not veer into. And Israel's prime minister comes up and says, what a beautiful moment. Remember this day, we just made history. And literally at the same time that he's saying this, Israeli snipers on that one day killed 61 protesters and injured thousands. And when I say injured, the specificity of these wounds are appalling. So in some cases, the snipers would use what's called dum-dum bullets, which go into one entry, explode, and then take part of the flesh with them on the way out. In other instances, a bullet can come through one leg and hit the other. In other instances, a bullet can hit two people. And in one instance that was documented by a medical professional, a doctor called Ghassan Abu Sitta, who went to Gaza with a Belgian NGO to treat the wounded, he said that he found someone with 2 wounds in both knees. And at the beginning, the medical team thought that those wounds were caused by one bullet. But the trick here is that there were 2 bullets in each wound. So there was 1 bullet in each wound. And it's implausible that you get hit by a sniper rifle and you remain in place to get another shot. The force and the weight of that moment, it throws some people into the air. So he describes that the only way this could have happened is if 2 snipers agreed at the same time to target this person. And shortly after, this headline comes up, in which an Israeli sniper is super proud, unremorseful, and says, I shot 42 knees in one day. And it documents in detail just testimonies of unremorseful Israeli soldiers, just describing what happened there. They didn't have a feeling of guilt. They were not trying to admit any sort of wrongdoing. They were just casually talking to an Israeli media about what they did. And this sniper, he says that my friend next to me was in charge of holding a binocular to locate the targets. At the end of the day, he was a little ashamed that he did not shoot any knees. So I agreed with him. I take the binocular, shoot a couple of knees, and then we go home. And with that, some of the details they describe in there is basically that they were playing it as a game. They saw young Palestinian children taking it as a challenge to go and touch the fence. And they described that perhaps for those kids, it was gamified into a score and a point game, in which if you touch the top of the fence, you get 10 points. If you throw a rock, you get 20 points. They knew that into their hearts fully. And they took it as a game as well, that if you touch the fence, I'm not going to let you get away with it. And they described that in detail. But that does not look very pleasant for Israel. It falls short of trying to counter up a significant and satisfactory justification for this, in which the aid industry comes in as the rescue. So in November, these suitcases come into Gaza just in a car. Each one of them is loaded with approximately $10 million. The only thing missing in those pictures is just cartoon dollar signs on the side. Nothing else is missing. They were coming from Qatar. They landed in Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv, Israel. They got the approval of the Israeli Prime Minister himself that this money goes to Hamas in Gaza. So suddenly the whole terror listing wall collapses. And this money is handed to Hamas in cash, in cartoon money bags, with the full approval of Israel. Not just the Prime Minister, the Minister of Defense, who was critical of Netanyahu's policy in Gaza. And I will come back to that again. But these cash influxes, they come in with several purposes, which were tremendously novel and benign and certainly positive. One of them was buying fuel for Gaza's decaying power plant so that people would have more hours of electricity than 4 hours a day, and to operate hospitals as well. Some of the money went into cash handouts of $100. Now it goes $100 to 100,000 families, just giving them $100 in cash, and they do with it whatever they want. And some of it went to pay the salaries, literally the salaries of Hamas employees. And it becomes even more cartoonishly insane that the Israeli government demands to have a list of the beneficiaries, including the salaried Hamas employees that Israel is trying to do everything to terror list, squeeze, punish, cage, etc. in theory. And they say to the Qatari envoy, called Muhammad al-Amadi, an engineer, they say that we want you to take the fingerprints of each beneficiary and bring it to us. And Israel controls a database who receives the money, including Hamas members. And Israel yields a right to blacklist certain members of Hamas, but not others. So they say that those 100 people are not allowed to receive the cash. We're fine with the 150,000 that's left. Give them any amount. And this goes on from November 2018 until today, until this moment. It came for more than a year in literally these exact cartoon money bags with a dollar sign missing on the side. And each month it comes to Hamas, Hamas's employees, it comes to 100,000 families, pays for the electricity. And Israel's prime minister becomes very alarmed by the criticism he would receive about this. So he comes and says, this spin about the money is that we're giving money to Hamas, literally to Hamas, to keep Palestinians divided and prevent the two-state solution, literally prevent peace, prevent the peace process. The word peace that is always brought up meaninglessly. We just want to kill it. And the way to kill it is give money to Hamas to keep Hamas in charge of Gaza, keep Palestinians divided. But the underlying purpose of the money, according to Hamas leaders, according to people that were intimately familiar with the details, is that Israel demanded that if the money goes in, Hamas needs to keep protesters away from the fence to stop giving it negative PR. Then they demanded that Hamas ends the protests altogether. So Hamas becomes a subcontractor policeman in charge of fulfilling Israel's security in return for receiving money in cartoon money bags every month. At the same time, Israel continues to say to the EU, to the US, we're not allowed to talk to Hamas. We're not allowed to go to Gaza. If you talk to them, you're collaborating with terrorists. And simultaneously, it created a transactional relationship with Hamas that's even stronger than the relationship back then between Israel and its peace partner, the Palestinian Authority. So as the cash came in. I would love just to keep that picture for the rest of the time. As the cartoon money bags came in, Israel was deducting from the Palestinian Authority budget, because Israel collects tax revenue on behalf of the PA and then gives it to it at the end of each month. So they withheld $180 million from the PA's budget and said that we take this money away because you're paying this money to people that were either imprisoned, injured, or to the families of people that were killed by Israel. Israel never kills innocents. If they were imprisoned, injured, killed by Israel, then they are terrorists. We're paying money to terrorists. We're keeping that money away. At the same time, they're giving money to what they designate as terrorists, to Hamas. Comes in these cartoon money bags again. And in return, you have to suppress the protest as Hamas. You have to keep people away from the fence, even if they had to shoot to kill protesters to fulfill Israel's security demands. And then we have those three gentlemen here. This is Naftali Bennett, who's now the Prime Minister of Israel. This is Avigdor Lieberman, now the Minister of Finance, and that's Benny Gantz, the Minister of Defense. And they all were part of Netanyahu's coalition. All three of them, the thing in common is they worked as defense ministers under Netanyahu. So they were in charge fully of the Gaza Strip. They get to dictate anything that happens in Gaza, what goes in, what goes out, what's not allowed, what's allowed. And the other common thing between these three gentlemen is before they became ministers of defense, they would criticize and roast Netanyahu in the media repeatedly, say that Netanyahu's weak, he's giving money to Hamas. If I become the Minister of Defense, I would give the head of Hamas a week, 24 hours. And if they do not immediately disarm, I'm gonna kill them. Each single one of them says the same thing. We're giving money to Hamas, that's insane. We're not gonna do that. If I am the sitting Minister of Defense, I would be killing Hamas at every point. I would be punishing them, torturing them, doing everything possible to squeeze them. And each one of them becomes a Minister of Defense, and each one of them signs the check for the $30 million that are coming into Gaza in cartoon money bags. And the reason for that is reflected in the terminology that's used by the local population. So if you ask any random person in the street in Gaza, what do you think of the Qatari aid? Whether they are hateful and resentful of Hamas, whether they are actual members and leaders of Hamas. What do you think of the Qatari aid that's coming through Israel? They would immediately describe it as one thing, painkiller. Another synonym, anesthesia. Another synonym, it goes on and on as pacifiers. The population saw this clearly, that it's a bribe, it's meant to buy time, and the money that goes in, the $30 million, $100 to each poor family. So if you theoretically say that it comes on Monday, it ends up in Israel's hand on Friday, because all the commercial goods that are coming in Gaza are coming from Israel. Gaza's, or most of them, Gaza's economy is largely dependent on Israel by virtue of the blockade. So if you pour money in Gaza by the beginning of the week, it ends up back in Israel by the end of the week, because they have to pay the merchants, the providers of these goods, Israeli factories, Israeli plants, etc. And that fuels mistrust amongst the population. And these are the last 3 points that I'm going to conclude with. So in terms of mistrust, if you're getting money from someone for free, continuously, monthly, would you go up to them and take off your shoe and throw it in their face? And that's literally what happened in Gaza. People at the borders saw the Qatari ambassador coming there, and he was instructing a Hamas leader, heard on audio, saying, we want quiet today, keep the protests quiet. And then a few minutes later, people come up and attack him. He's giving Gaza millions of dollars in aid, and he's being attacked. And he is merely an intermediary between Israel and Hamas. So Qatar is giving that money, although it does not have to, but it's giving the money for its own political reasons. And Israel is the main beneficiary of it. It gets calm, it gets to push the protests away, and eventually it managed to kill the protests altogether. So people stopped showing up when Hamas is keeping them away from the fence, or when nothing is happening. The main reason of nonviolence is to evoke the humanity in the hearts of not just the international community, but even in the hearts of your opponents and enemies. But with this scenario of the Great Return March, the only images that were flowing were just Israeli snipers, Palestinians throwing rocks, Palestinians being dead and wounded. That's it. The main focus in the international community was whether it was proportionate for Israel to shoot those people with sniper rifles. It was not a question of why did people go there in the first place. That question, one of the intuitive answers that were provided by Israel is that literally everyone at the borders was forced to show up at the fence, put their life at risk by the orders of Hamas, that Hamas is controlling the whole thing. It's bringing people in, forcing them at gunpoint out of their beds in the morning, come on with us, stand at the borders and wait until you get shot. That was the Israeli pretext for why people showed up there. So with this PR problem that Israel had, the aid industry was the answer. And I think you can never get a more explicit situation in which you have aid functioning to the adverse and the very detriment of the population it's funding, where it's literally a painkiller and a pacifier. And then two striking things happen. One thing is that the balloons that I mentioned at the beginning and the tires, the balloons that people were attaching letters of that we want to live, we want peace, or any letters you could think of that they attached and threw it to Israel, became a weapon. So they were largely ignored by the international community, by the international media, mainstream media. At the same time, there were instances of stories in the media about Israeli kids throwing balloons of peace towards Gaza. And the story was framed as, look, our kids are sending message of peace. Gazans want to storm Israel and kill civilians. And they are at the borders. The narrative and the framing of it was that those people at the borders are barbarians, just waiting to cross into our land and eat Israeli civilians alive. So that the balloons, when they were ignored altogether, some young people just came up with a smart-ass idea. They attached a little incendiary object. So you get a piece of cloth, you dip it in gasoline, you attach it to the balloons, and you let it fly. And once these balloons run out of air, once they fall down again, they ignite fire to their surroundings, which is the Israeli farms that are surrounding Gaza, or Israeli basic agricultural lands, or just empty lands in general. And they start flying these balloons. And Israel gets way more irritated by these balloons than Hamas rockets, because if it acts disproportionately against an incendiary balloon and bombs an entire building, it's going to look ridiculous. It's not going to sell as a positive PR message. It cannot be spent around. So the way Israel handles this is the same remedy. Use the Qatari cash to get Hamas to stop the balloons. And in some instances, Hamas arrests people under charge of throwing balloons on Israel. And Hamas claims to be the main group that is actively resisting Israel's occupation, and that they are the last, almost the last mainstream group of the two, Fatah and Hamas, who's doing something about resistance. And at the same time, they are arresting people for throwing balloons. And if you ask Hamas members or leaders, why did you accept the bribe? Or if you ask normal average Gazans, they would be very critical of it as a painkiller, but they would say at least it's keeping life going in Gaza to a minimal extent. Nobody else is doing anything about it. Europe is not acting, the US is not acting, Arab countries are turning their backs on us. So it's either taking the money or complete starvation. So in their eyes, they have their own legitimation for acting this way. And then a new paradigm emerges that I will conclude with, in which resistance is instrumentalized to ask for more bribes. So the Qatari money, when it came to Gaza, it came first for 6 months. It was designated as a 6 months aid package, and that's it. But every time this time frame came to an end, or every time Israel procrastinated in allowing the cash to go to Gaza in cartoon money bags, then young people got a permit from Hamas to go at the borders and throw these balloons, continue to throw them indefinitely until Israel feels the pressure and allows the cash in. And it's used simultaneously. They use the balloons, they use the tires, they would just take the tires and burn them so that the smoke goes to Israeli communities nearby or towns. And they used one or two less things. They used loudspeakers at night. The closest Israeli town to Gaza is at least 2 kilometers away or more. There is, because it's considered by Israel as a military zone, so there is a large swathe of land that is militarized where no person can cross, and Israeli vehicles and soldiers are there. But they cannot reach to those towns, or they cannot even hurt the Israeli soldiers if they're well protected. So they brought giant loudspeakers and blasted music in the dead of the night. So they wait until midnight and blast music as loud as it is. And then they got laser pointers, and in the dead of darkness, they just pointed at Israeli soldiers. And that gives Israeli soldiers their worst nightmare. Because how can you justify shooting someone who's just pointing a laser in the air? It cannot be spinned around, and you cannot easily see the targets in the night and act upon it. So Israel, literally every time, it repeated itself as a cycle. That every time the money does not come in, this is activated, the loudspeakers, the laser pointers, and the tire burning. Then the money comes in again. Then we have the gentleman, the first one, Naftali Bennett, who became recently Israel's prime minister. So as soon as he comes to power, he says, I'm gonna be a game changer. I'm gonna restore our relationship with the PA and punish Hamas. I'm gonna empower the PA, disempower Hamas. I'm not gonna allow the cash to go in Gaza. 1 month of these loudspeakers, balloons, lasers, allows it to flow back in, but only to the 100,000 families that get the cash handouts. Then tensions rise again. He allows it to Hamas civil servants. And if it goes on and on like that, they would come up with newer and newer bribes. So some of the latest bribes that Israel came up with is allowing individual Gazans, number up until now is only 7,000 people out of 2 million people, allowing 7,000 Gazans what is called a merchant permit. Because Israel gives a permit to rich Gazans to go and do business in Israel, to bring Israel money. So they get a VIP permit to cross the borders, go in Israel, travel around, make deals with factories and shops and markets, etc., and pour money in Israel and bring merchandise into Gaza. So Israel comes up with a genius idea of saying that we will secretly allow 7,000 people to come and look for jobs in Israel from Gaza. Because if they bring it up in the media, the government is going to be fiercely criticized for, you've been telling us that those are monsters at the borders. If they come in, they're going to eat us alive, and now you're allowing 7,000 of them to come in. So they come up with this clever designation to say that those are not people looking for jobs, those are rich, privileged Gazans coming in to do business. And 7,000 people are allowed in to go and work in Israel. But the last implication of this paradigm is basically this. And it was for a limited period of time, but it's likely to emerge again because the underlying conditions are unchanged. So the Qatari money is coming in, the protests are dying out. Then you get armed, independent or anarchist or not necessarily centralized, just small armed groups throwing projectiles on Israel, and I will not call them rockets. The rocket is what, in our imagination, this giant missile that has an explosive head. There's not an abundance of that in Gaza. What is predominant, especially for small militias, is basically just getting a can, a tuna can or a kidney beans can, putting some gunpowder in it that's from like fireworks, etc., and letting it fly in Israel without an explosive head or a destructive power in some of the cases. Again, not a generalization, but for small groups, that's the case. It costs at best around $100, less than 700 Danish crowns. And they do this out of maybe grievances, but the main purpose of it is to shake up the whole status quo, to shake up the understanding. We cannot accept the money coming in as a bribe. We cannot accept the death of the protests. And this goes on for some time until Israel manages to locate the architect of this newly emerging paradigm, and they assassinate him, and the whole case is closed down. But what I want to emphasize is, again, that this is something that can never happen in comparable examples where resistance becomes a tool to demand more painkillers and bribes. And I conclude here.